NASA is going back to the moon. The next flight of the Artemis program, Artemis II, which will be the first Artemis flight with crew, is scheduled for September 2025. The first moon landing in over 50 years is scheduled for September of 2026. Now, let's talk about why NASA's triumphant return to the moon will likely not happen on schedule. I'm Swapna Krishna, and today on Astra, we're going to talk about why NASA's moon landing is going to be delayed. If you're wholly unfamiliar with the Artemis program and weren't even aware that NASA was planning on going back to the moon, I have an entire overview of what we know about the program, so check out that video if you're interested. Right now, though, I'm going to dive into a bunch of things that are going wrong and the things that still need to be figured out before NASA can put astronauts back on the moon. This isn't fully comprehensive, but there is a lot going on here. Before I dive in, I want to make clear, I have tremendous respect for NASA, and I have a lot of respect for the people working there, as well as their partners. I like this program. I want NASA to go back to the moon. This is not intended as an attack or a diatribe. I'm just trying to talk honestly about my understanding of what is going on with Artemis. Here is what you need to know for the purposes of this video. Orion is the crew capsule that will carry astronauts to the moon. SLS is the giant rocket that's controversial because of its high cost. Artemis I was the first flight of the program without crew that lifted off on November 16, 2022. For the most part, that flight went very well. Artemis II is the first crewed flight of the program that will see 4 astronauts fly Orion around the moon on a 10-day mission. That's scheduled for September 2025, while Artemis III, the first moon landing that will see 2 NASA astronauts set foot on the moon, is scheduled for September 2026. It kind of goes without saying that if Artemis II is significantly delayed, it's hard to imagine that Artemis III will still be able to make a September 2026 launch date. Now, let's talk about the problems NASA is facing with the next 2 missions of the Artemis program. On Artemis I, which was basically an uncrewed test flight of the SLS rocket and Orion capsule, NASA teams noticed something odd about the Orion capsule. The heat shield didn't behave as they expected. I go into this in depth in a previous video, so if you're interested in the specifics, check that out. But the short story is that the heat shield is located at the base of the Orion capsule. It's made of a material called avcoat, which is ablative, which basically means it protects the capsule from the heat of re-entry by melting off. But for that first flight, it was charring and it came off in chunks. There was much more liberation of heat shield material than was expected, which is not how this is supposed to go. It's not good for many reasons. The bottom line is that if crew had been aboard, they wouldn't have experienced any discomfort and they would have returned safely. But just because the crew would have been safe doesn't mean NASA doesn't have to figure out what's going on. NASA has a history of not exploring the root cause of problems when they occur. That culture led to both the Challenger and the Columbia disasters, so NASA needs to make sure they understand this problem and why it's happening. The organization has been very tight-lipped about this issue. The only reason we really know any details at all is that back in May, a report from the NASA Office of the Inspector General came out on NASA's readiness for Artemis II. That report revealed the extent of the problem, gave us our only images of the damage, and informed us that the heat shield was part of the reason the Artemis II was delayed from November 2024 to September 2025. According to NASA's response to that report, an independent review board convened in May 2024 to try and find the root cause of this heat shield charring. Their estimated date was to have a report ready by around June 30th, 2024. As you can imagine, I took quite a bit of interest in this because I think it's a big issue. I started reaching out to NASA in mid-June and then pinging them after that every 1 to 2 weeks to see if there was a report ready or any findings at all that they could disclose. I basically got, "We expect something soon, check back in the next couple of weeks," over and over again. Well, at the end of August, a NASA official publicly confirmed that the review board had completed their investigation. So I checked back. And on September 6th, I got this response. I quote, In talking with the program office, they said that although the investigative review teams have concluded, the heat shield continues to be a sensitive topic as outbriefs and discussions will continue leading up to teams converging on a path forward. Until the administrator announces that decision, likely publicly with a media telecon but not known at this time, we will not be in a position to provide media interaction at the program level. Basically, from this I inferred that the review board had found the cause and was trying to figure out how to proceed from there. And then this week, Ars Technica reported that Lori Glaze, Acting Deputy Associate Administrator for NASA's Exploration Systems Development Mission Directorate, did confirm that NASA had found the root cause of the issue and was embarking on more testing, which they expect to finish up by the end of November. And at that point, Administrator Nelson himself will be involved in the final decisions. You can bet I will be tuning in and reporting back on that media briefing. But basically, what are even the options here? There are two main ones. First, they could rebuild the heat shield to correct the flaws. But the thing is, the heat shield is already mounted to the Artemis II capsule, so this would require disassembling the entire thing. That could mean a delay of 1 to 2 years for the mission if this is the path forward. The other option is just change the re-entry angle. It is possible that changing Orion's flight plan and how it re-enters could lead to less stress on the heat shield and lower temperatures, and less charring as a result. Changes to the heat shield could then be implemented for Artemis III on. The key is they have to do whatever is best for crew safety because that is the most important thing. Now, if NASA can figure out the heat shield issue and come up with a solution for Artemis II that doesn't involve dismantling the capsule, it is possible that Artemis II could launch on or around its target date. But also, there's more going on here. I'm not done yet. Let's talk about SLS. SLS, or the Space Launch System, is NASA's mega rocket that will end up costing somewhere around $4.2 billion per launch, which is just an eye-watering figure. But SLS did do well for Artemis I. There were a lot of issues loading propellant that delayed the launch, but once SLS was off the ground, it performed very well. For the duration of the flight, it either met or exceeded expectations. Now, Artemis II will be the first crewed launch of the program and the first time putting crew on SLS, but the rocket will be pretty much the same. NASA is planning on making some tweaks to the fueling process to make propellant loading go more smoothly, but most of the changes to SLS between Artemis I and II are to ground systems, which I'll talk about later. There will likely be similar changes based on lessons learned between Artemis II and Artemis III. So again, I don't feel like SLS is a huge stumbling block here. But one thing to note, the Orion heat shield issue I talked about previously is impacting stacking SLS for Artemis II. I'll explain the ground hardware a little later, but NASA is currently preparing to stack SLS for Artemis II in the Vehicle Assembly Building at Cape Canaveral with Mobile Launcher 1. The core stage, solid rocket boosters, and launch vehicle stage adapter are ready to go. They could start stacking the rocket in the next few weeks. But the thing is, once they do, they need to be within about a year of launch because the joints connecting the pieces of SLS's solid rocket boosters to the core are only certified for a year. That being said, NASA extended that to 2 years for Artemis I, so again, not a huge deal. Waiting a few weeks to stack the rocket on a launch platform isn't a huge deal, but it's a good example of how one problem with a single part of the spacecraft can ripple across the entire mission. What is a stumbling block is the status of the lunar lander. We don't need a lunar lander for Artemis II. It's a crewed flight, but there is no landing. For Artemis III, there is a landing, and they will use HLS, or the Human Landing System, to get to the surface of the moon. HLS will stay on the surface with them, and then the 2 astronauts will return to lunar orbit in HLS. Artemis III is a really complicated mission. If you're familiar with the Apollo program, they had 4 crewed flights before attempting a lunar landing with Apollo 11. Apollo 7 was the first crewed flight of the program after the Apollo 1 tragedy, and that was just basically testing the hardware. Then Apollo 8 went around the moon. Apollo 9 tested the lunar module for the first time in orbit. Apollo 10 went to lunar orbit and undocked and flew the lunar module, but did not land. And then Apollo 11 was the lunar landing. For Artemis, there is only one flight to test the Orion capsule and SLS rocket with crew before the attempted lunar landing on Artemis III. Now, we have been to the moon before, of course, but that doesn't change the fact that this is all new hardware that needs to be tested in space to make sure it works. That's why the state of HLS is such a big deal. It's going to be built by SpaceX as a variation of Starship, which is why NASA is watching those test flights of Starship so closely, because they need Starship to be operational for Artemis III to land on the moon. The Artemis III mission profile would have HLS launch into Earth orbit, where it will be refueled by Starship tankers that are already in Earth orbit. This is why SpaceX is working on propellant transfer demonstrations for Starship. Another one is scheduled for 2025. Once refueled, HLS will head to the moon and place itself in near rectilinear halo orbit around the moon. Then Artemis II would launch, an Orion crew vehicle on an SLS rocket. It'll dock with Starship in lunar orbit. 2 astronauts would transfer from HLS to Orion and then descend to the lunar surface near the moon's south pole, stay there for about a week, and then return to lunar orbit. The thing is, if we were just talking about one HLS vehicle, maybe it's doable. Keep in mind that Starship isn't operational yet, and there are still quite a few test flights that need to happen before it can become operational. This is part of SpaceX's current fight with the FAA over launch licensing, which these regulations are a whole story to themselves. I will get into that in another video. SpaceX needs to have a fleet of tankers in orbit to refuel HLS. Estimates put it somewhere between 15 to 20 to be able to carry enough propellant to fully refuel HLS because of cryogenic propellant boil-off. SpaceX can build hardware fast enough. I'm not too worried about that aspect of it. But getting Starship operational, having enough Starship launches to get that many tankers, being able to launch them in rapid succession so early after Starship is operational, demonstrating Starship's crew comfort and life support systems can work in space and on the lunar surface. There is a lot that has to go right here in a very short amount of time. We're less than 2 years away from the scheduled launch of Artemis III, and Starship isn't even operational yet. It's so much to test out that there have been whispers that NASA is looking at simplifying the parameters of Artemis III to do more hardware testing and not making it a landing mission. But until the whispers get much, much louder or the agency makes an announcement, we have to assume that Artemis III will stick to its current mission profile. While it really does not seem like HLS will be ready in time, I also don't want to count out SpaceX fully. SpaceX has demonstrated a wild lack of adherence to their own stated timeframes, but they've also pulled off incredible feats. That being said, an internal NASA analysis that took place in December of 2023 shows HLS as likely being delivered at least a year and a half late. There is currently 70% confidence that HLS will be ready for a lunar landing by February 2028. I should also mention that NASA awarded a second contract for a lunar lander last year to Blue Origin, but this hardware isn't supposed to be ready until Artemis V, currently scheduled for 2029. Okay, but let's say SpaceX manages to pull it off. HLS is ready for a crewed mission by September 2026. Well, guess what else NASA astronauts need to walk on the moon? Spacesuits. And it's looking like these might not be ready in time either. NASA contracted with Axiom Space to build the new generation of moonwalking suits, called the Axiom Extravehicular Mobility Unit. We actually just got our first full look at the outer layer of these suits, designed by both Axiom Space and Prada. It's as yet unclear when the suits will be ready for a crewed mission. They are expecting to enter critical design review in 2025, which, if the suit passes, will mean Axiom has a go-ahead for production of the spacesuits. Again, maybe they will be ready. But one of the big criticisms of the Polaris Dawn Crew Dragon EVA was the number of firsts, including opening the hatch to the vacuum of space in spacesuits that hadn't been tested in space before. The whole thing went very well, but the question is this a similar issue? This may be part of those whispers around NASA about changing the profile of Artemis III, getting a chance to test out the moonwalking suits before the lunar landing. If you're wondering whether SpaceX suits can be used for Artemis, moonwalking suits have very specific needs, including being able to operate independently for at least 8 hours. SpaceX may very well be able to modify their suits to meet NASA's specifications. They have said previously that the suits used on Polaris Dawn will eventually be adapted for use on the Moon and Mars, but they are not currently usable as is. That being said, SpaceX might start out ahead because the spacesuit has already been tested in space on a brief EVA, but they'd still have to go through NASA's procedures and quality control, and the Polaris Dawn spacesuit did not have a personal life support system, or PLSS. The two spacewalkers, Jared Isaacman and Sarah Gillis on Polaris Dawn, were provided oxygen and power by umbilicals connected to their spacecraft. A PLSS is a huge component of a moon suit. It's half the suit, and it's necessary for a spacewalk. It's definitely an interesting option, but it's just not really clear whether SpaceX could have it operational in time. Plus, NASA doesn't like awarding too many contracts to a single provider, and SpaceX already has the HLS contract. Now, let's talk about the most exciting part: infrastructure. No. But seriously, let's talk about the Exploration Ground Systems, or EGS, and the mobile launcher. EGS is basically just the systems and facilities to support the mission. There are 3 parts of Exploration Ground Systems for Artemis: processing of the rockets and spacecraft, and integration, stacking, that sort of thing. Launch systems. And then finally, recovery of the crew and spacecraft. There is a lot of support that goes into missions like this, and EGS covers a lot of it. Well, a report from the GAO, Government Accountability Office, from about 2 weeks ago makes it clear that these systems might not be ready in time for Artemis II. The first testing of a lot of these systems was with Artemis I, but adding a crew to a flight drastically increases its complexity and the need for redundancy. There are quite a few risks here. Software is looking like it might not be ready. There's still work to do on the emergency egress systems. There's issues with environmental controls. The crew access arm is having problems and needs more testing. Most of the stuff isn't too major, but the problem that the GAO points out is that there's no schedule margin left in case any of these things becomes a real problem. There's about 3 months of flexibility to complete all of these things to support a September 2025 launch date for Artemis II, but NASA apparently already assigned all of that margin to the refurbishment and upgrades of Mobile Launcher 1, which means that if any of these other things have more problems than expected, it will likely delay the Artemis II launch. And this is space, so there are always more problems than expected. This brings me to the Mobile Launcher. Mobile Launcher 1, or ML1, was used during Artemis I. These basically support the stacking and testing of the rocket, transfer SLS and Orion to the launch pad, and is the structural support to launch the rocket. Right now, there's only one mobile launcher. A second one is being constructed to be used for Artemis IV and beyond. It will not shock you at this point to know it is delayed. A report from the NASA Office of the Inspector General from back in August says that ML2 will likely not be ready until spring 2029. Well, Artemis IV is supposed to launch in September 2028. But also, considering the problem with Boeing's building of the SLS Block 1B, which will be necessary for Artemis IV, I will be shocked if that mission takes off as planned. But more on that in another video. Back to ML1. It sustained a surprising amount of damage as a result of Artemis I. The crew elevator doors were blown off, cameras were destroyed, the crew access arm was damaged. It took a while to repair. While NASA had ML1 in the VAB, they were also upgrading it to support Artemis II. ML1 was rolled to the VAB in December of 2022 for these repairs and refurbishment, and it's only in the past few weeks that it's ready to start stacking Artemis II. Which means that it took almost 2 years to refurbish and to upgrade. There's only 1 year on the schedule between Artemis II and Artemis III, which means that the refurbishment and upgrades for that mission have to be a lot faster. Part of the reason repairs to ML1 have taken so long is that NASA wanted to ensure that the structure is more robust, so fewer repairs will be necessary after Artemis II launches, plus the modifications that need to be made between 2 crewed launches is much less intensive than those that need to be made between Artemis I and Artemis II, an uncrewed mission and a crewed mission. All of that being said though, the mobile launcher is still a concern here in terms of schedule. Finally, yes, I'm almost done talking at you. Let's talk about the budget. To be clear, this isn't specifically a thing that's going to delay Artemis II or III, But a GAO report from back in January pointed out that NASA hasn't publicly delivered a cost estimate for Artemis III. This mission is supposed to happen in less than 2 years, and we don't really know how much it's going to cost. Instead of providing a full cost estimate, NASA is just asking for funding year to year in its budget requests. But that means the people making the decisions have no idea what the all-in cost for this lunar landing will be. My guess is part of the reasoning here is that NASA doesn't want to make it easier to cancel Artemis missions by separating them out. The idea might be funding the whole Artemis program year to year rather than an individual mission, because there are large upfront costs to build infrastructure that will get reused throughout the program. But it also makes it seem like Artemis is just this huge aimless blob that isn't really going anywhere or doing anything, or it's just spending money, especially because of the high costs of SLS. For reference, for fiscal year 2024, NASA requested $6.8 billion for the Artemis program. Of that, SLS was $2.5 billion. Not offering clarity into budgets is a great way to be underfunded, or even worse, have a program fully canceled. And without the money to make Artemis happen, there is no way NASA will meet their September 2026 goal of landing on the moon. So, that is my rundown of why I think it's unlikely NASA will make the September 2026 goal of landing astronauts on the moon for the first time in over 50 years. To be clear, again, I like the Artemis program and I hope I'm wrong, but there is too much up in the air for me to really think that this will go off as planned. But for now, thanks for watching. I am Swapna Krishna, and this is Ad Astra.